You're what? I stared at my mother-in-law, Verla, in disbelief. Her perfectly coiffed hair and impeccable makeup couldn't mask the smug expression on her face. I said I'll be hosting my annual charity gala here at your home this weekend, she repeated, eyeing the living room with disdain. And you'll be assisting me, of course. I fought the urge to roll my eyes. Typical Verla, barging in and taking over without asking. I have a major project due next week, I said, trying to keep my tone even. I can't just drop everything to cater to your whims. Verla's laugh was condescending. A project? Don't be ridiculous, Lyndon. Your little design jobs are hardly a priority compared to the important work I do for the community. My cheeks burned, but I refused to back down. This little design job pays our bills, in case you've forgotten. Yes, well, we can't all have husbands with real careers, can we? She waved a perfectly manicured hand dismissively. Now, about the gala. As Verla droned on about guest lists and catering, I tuned her out, seething inside. This was just like her, acting like my work was meaningless, assuming I'd drop everything to serve her every whim. Well, not this time. So you'll need to have the house spotless, Verla was saying. I can't have my guests thinking we live like slobs. That did it. You know what, Verla? I cut her off, my voice tight with barely contained fury. I'll host your precious gala. Her eyebrows shot up, clearly surprised by my uncharacteristic defiance. You will? Yes. And I'll make it the best damn event you've ever seen. I leaned in, locking eyes with her. Just watch me. For once, Verla seemed at a loss for words. Good. Maybe now she'd finally see that I wasn't the pushover she thought I was. This gala was war, and I had no intention of losing. The moment Verla swept out of the house, a manic grin spread across my face. This was it. My chance to finally prove her wrong about me. I pulled out my laptop, cracking my knuckles as I opened up a new project file. Time to get organized. For the next few hours, I mapped out a meticulous plan, breaking down every aspect of the gala into manageable tasks. Catering, decor, guest list, entertainment, I covered it all, reveling in the thrill of executing a major event. This was what I lived for. By the time Beckett got home that evening, I'd already secured 3 potential caterers and was comparing their menus. What's all this? He asked, peering over my shoulder. Your mother's gala, I replied tersely. I'm taking charge. He let out a low whistle. Bold move. You know how she gets. Exactly. I turned to face him, my jaw set with determination, which is why I'm going to blow this event out of the water. Verla thinks I'm some hapless little housewife who can't handle real responsibility. Well, she's in for a rude awakening. A small smile tugged at the corners of Beckett's mouth. You've got that look in your eye, he murmured. I almost feel sorry for her. I shot him a steely glance. Don't. She brought this on herself with her constant belittling and meddling. I shook my head, the anger resurging within me. I'm done being her doormat, Beckett. It's time she learned some respect. He held up his hands in surrender. Hey, I'm not arguing with you. Just don't go too far, okay? You know how vicious she can get. There was a tinge of warning in his voice that I chose to ignore. Let Verla throw her worst at me. I could handle it. This was about more than just putting on some fancy party. It was about standing up for myself, about showing that shrew of a mother-in-law that I wasn't the pushover she thought. No more Mrs. Nice Lyndon. If she wanted a war, she'd get one. Over the next few days, I attacked the preparations with a single-minded focus. I interviewed caterers, touring their kitchens and scrutinizing every last detail. I pored over fabric swatches and floral arrangements, determined to create an aesthetic that would put Verla's past events to shame. And through it all, I could sense her watching me from the sidelines, those cold eyes narrowed in suspicion. A few times she even tried to insert herself, offering helpful suggestions that were really just thinly veiled critiques. That color palette is a bit bold, don't you think? She'd say, wrinkling her nose at the rich jewel tones I'd chosen. Or, the portions from that caterer seem rather petite. You'll want something more substantial if you don't want people leaving hungry. Each time, I'd flash her a saccharine smile and politely stand my ground. Don't worry, Verla. I've got it all under control. The look of consternation on her face was priceless. She'd always been the one calling the shots, and for once the tables were turned. And she clearly didn't like it one bit. Good. If she thought I was going to buckle under her scrutiny, she was sorely mistaken. This gala was my turf now. And by the time it was over, Verla would have no choice but to respect me, whether she wanted to or not. As the gala preparations kicked into high gear, I began noticing little things going awry. Tiny sabotages that could only be the work of one person, Verla. First, it was the catering company I'd hired backing out at the last minute, some vague excuse about a kitchen fire. Then, the florist called to say they were out of the specific varietal of roses I'd requested, even though I'd placed the order weeks in advance. At first, I tried to shrug it off as mere coincidence, but then I overheard Verla on the phone one afternoon, her sickly sweet voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear, having to cope with such an incompetent host for my event." A pause, then a pointed look in my direction. "Well, you know how it is. Some people just aren't cut out for this sort of thing." My blood boiled, but I bit my tongue, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Two could play at her little mind games. Instead, I doubled down, working twice as hard to course-correct around her petty interferences. When the caterer fell through, I managed to book an even better one, a prestigious company that just so happened to be Verla's former vendor before they'd parted ways on bad terms. The look on her face when she realized who I'd hired was utterly priceless. "You can't be serious, Lyndon," she hissed at me one evening, once the ink had dried on the contract. "After everything they've done to smear my reputation?" I shrugged, feigning innocence. "They came highly recommended, and their menu is to die for." Verla's eyes narrowed to slits. "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" "Whatever do you mean?" I batted my eyelashes at her. "I'm simply trying to put together the best possible event for you, Mother." She opened her mouth, no doubt to hurl a biting retort my way, but seemed to think better of it. With a curt snort, she spun on her heel and stormed off. I permitted myself a tiny smirk. "Point, Lyndon." Of course, that was just the beginning of our escalating hostilities. As the gala drew nearer, Verla's attempts to undermine me grew increasingly brazen and increasingly transparent. Fake termite tenting notices printed with a bogus company name, left around the house where her snooty charity friends could easily spot them. Mysterious double bookings with vendors I'd already secured. Heck, I even caught her rewriting portions of the guest list, no doubt in an effort to stack the attendees against me. Each time, I shut her down with a polite smile and an iron grip on the reins, making it clear who was really in charge. But it was more than just gamesmanship at this point. It was personal. With her every hostile action, her true colors shone through more and more. This wasn't just about the gala anymore. It was about exposing Verla for the petty, manipulative shrew she really was. One morning, I caught her in the act of scribbling disparaging comments about me in the notations column of the master guest list, insults and snide remarks that those who didn't know better might easily take at face value. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, snatching the binder out of her hands. For once, she didn't try to deny it. "Simply ensuring my guests know what kind of hostess they're dealing with," she sneered. I shook my head slowly, tamping down the rage boiling up inside me. "You just can't help yourself, can you? Always scheming, always putting others down to make yourself feel better. Don't take it so personally, dear." Her smile was saccharine poison. "I'm just trying to manage expectations." "No." I took a step closer, holding her gaze with steely conviction. "No more lies, Verla. No more manipulations." I jabbed a finger at her. "This gala is going to be perfect, and by the time it's over, everyone's going to see you for who you really are." She drew herself up haughtily, but I could see the briefest flicker of uncertainty in her cold eyes. "Is that a threat?" "No." I allowed myself a thin smile, baring my teeth. "It's a promise. Game on, you wretched old harpy. I was done playing nice, and by the end of all this, it would be Verla who was exposed as the fraud, not me." As if Verla's sabotage attempts weren't enough, I soon realized she was trying to turn Beckett against me, too. Whenever he was around, she'd make snide comments about how stressed I seemed, or not so subtly imply that I was in over my head with the gala. "Are you sure you can handle all this, dear?" she'd trill in that sickly sweet tone. "It seems like an awful lot for one person to take on." Beckett, bless his heart, would just shake his head and smile weakly whenever I shot him an exasperated look. "Don't let her get to you," he'd murmur. "You know how she is." But the digs kept coming. Verla's needling growing more pointed by the day. And as much as I tried to brush it off, I could see the seeds of doubt starting to take root in Beckett's mind. Would I really be able to pull this off? Or was I cracking under the pressure like his mother claimed? The thought made my chest tighten with anger and determination. No way was I going to give that miserable shrew the satisfaction of being right. Fortunately, I wasn't completely alone in my war against Verla. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one of her so-called friends who had been on the receiving end of her two-faced treachery over the years. By sheer chance, one of the vendors I'd hired put me in touch with a woman named Eliza, one of Verla's former confidants who'd suffered a brutal falling out after daring to outshine her at some charity luncheon years earlier. "That woman is a viper," Eliza warned me one afternoon over coffee. "She'll stop at nothing to claw her way to the top, even if it means sabotaging those closest to her." I shuddered, realizing how accurately she was describing the stunts Verla had already pulled. "You're telling me she's made this entire process a nightmare, all because she can't stand to see me succeed?" Eliza nodded grimly. "Believe me, I know the feeling, which is why—" She leaned in conspiratorially. "I want to help take her down a peg or two." My eyes widened, but I couldn't deny the thrill of excitement that zipped through me. "What did you have in mind?" It turned out Eliza wasn't the only one of Verla's former inner circle who had horror stories to share. Over the next few days, she introduced me to an entire network of wealthy women who had all fallen victim to Verla's vindictive narcissism at one point or another. There was Margaret, whose dream kitchen renovation had ended up being featured in Verla's favorite design magazine instead of her own, an incident Verla had orchestrated through underhanded means. And Diane, who had donated a small fortune to one of Verla's pet charities only to be ruthlessly edged out from a committee position she had been promised. One by one, these women shared their stories, their hurt and anger still palpable years later, and as I listened, a plan began to take shape in my mind. "We can't just let her keep getting away with this," I declared one afternoon, as we convened in Margaret's parlor over bone-dry scones. "She has to be stopped." Here, Eliza agreed, raising her teacup. "I'll drink to that." "But how?" Diane shook her head glumly. "That woman has more lives than a cat. She always seems to land on her feet, no matter what." I sat back, chewing my lip as I considered their words. They were right. Simply exposing Verla's vindictiveness wouldn't be enough. Not when she'd so deftly deflected countless accusations in the past. No, if we were going to take her down once and for all, we'd need to strike at the very heart of what she valued most. Her wealth, her status, her sense of superiority over everyone around her. We'd need to dismantle her precious hierarchy from the inside out. A slow smile curved my lips as the plan crystallized. "Ladies, what would you say to making this gala one for the history books?" Diane arched one perfectly groomed eyebrow. "I'm listening." Over the next few days, we plotted and schemed, trading strategies like girlfriends dishing about a hot new crush, and with each new co-conspirator I brought into the fold, I felt a giddy sense of anticipation building inside me. Let Verla try to throw obstacles in my way. Let her whisper and taunt and do her worst. Because by the time this gala was over, she wouldn't know what hit her. Revolution was coming, and I was leading the charge. The night before the gala, I was putting the finishing touches on the seating arrangements when my phone rang. Frowning at the unfamiliar number, I answered with trepidation. "Hello?" "Yes. Hi, is this Lyndon?" The clipped, professional voice on the other end did nothing to ease my nerves. "Speaking. Who is this?" "I'm calling from Mashad Catering. I'm afraid we have to cancel our services for your event tomorrow." My heart plummeted into my stomach. "Cancel? But why? We had a signed contract." "Yes, well, an unavoidable situation has arisen." The woman's tone held no hint of apology. "A broken refrigeration unit, you understand, simply can't operate under those conditions. I'm sure you can appreciate." "I most certainly do not appreciate." I cut her off, fury rapidly replacing my shock. "Do you have any idea how last minute this is? My event is in less than 24 hours. A simpering sigh. "I understand this is an inconvenience, but I'm afraid our hands are tied. Still, I'm happy to recommend some other." I didn't let her finish. Jabbing the end button with a vicious stab, I slammed the phone down, chest heaving. There was no way this was a coincidence. Not with everything else Verla had pulled leading up to this point. That conniving, miserable snake. Even now, she just couldn't let me have this one moment of triumph, could she? For a long moment, I simply stood there, fists clenched at my sides as waves of anger and frustration crashed over me. After all my hard work, all my meticulous planning to have it derailed at the last possible second by one of Verla's dirty tricks. A small, treacherous voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe I should just call the whole thing off. Save myself the inevitable humiliation and embarrassment of a gala with no food to serve the hoity-toity guests. Verla would win, yet again. But just as quickly, a deeper, more primal part of me roared in defiant outrage. Like hell, I was going to let that miserable harpy win. If she thought a petty stunt like this was enough to make me throw in the towel, she had another thing coming. Snatching up my laptop, I began firing off a flurry of emails and texts to every reputable caterer in the area, desperate to find a last-minute replacement. Vendor after vendor came back with the same curt refusal. Booked solid, too late a notice, apologies, but no availability. I was rapidly losing hope when a notification pinged through from an unexpected source. The events coordinator at the West Grove, one of the city's most elite and expensive catering companies. Formerly under exclusive contract to Verla's charity group, they had parted ways 2 years ago under acrimonious terms after Verla had tried to blackball them over a minor squabble. The message was short and to the point. Saw your distress call for catering tomorrow. Would be delighted to assist if still needed. Let's bury the hatchet, shall we? A delirious grin split my face as I fired back an enthusiastic acceptance. Not only had I secured prestigious top-tier catering at virtually the last possible second, but I'd managed to do it in a way that would surely rankle Verla to her core. Let the old bat chew on that while she plotted her next move. When Verla swept into the kitchen the next morning, I could tell from her pinched expression that she'd caught wind of my catering coup. "Lyndon," she greeted me stiffly, "I see you've made alternate arrangements." "Indeed I have." I met her chilly gaze with an impassive one of my own. "Only the best for your precious Gala, Verla?" Her eyes narrowed to slits. "The West Grove? Really, Lyndon, I thought you had more class than to resort to such tawdry lowlives." I shrugged, adopting an air of nonchalance. "Sticks and stones, Verla. I prefer to judge people by their skill and professionalism, not petty feuds that have nothing to do with me." "Feuds?" She looked fit to burst, her perfectly sprayed coif practically quivering with outrage. For a moment, I thought she might actually rip into me right then and there, but some last lingering shred of self-control seemed to prevail, and she settled for a disdainful sniff. "Well, I certainly hope, for everyone's sake, that this little act of spite on your part doesn't become an embarrassment for all involved." With that parting shot, she turned on her heel and stormed out, clicking across the marble foyer in her stratospheric heels. Clearly, she had expected her catering sabotage to break me. Too bad for her. I didn't break that easily anymore. As the staffers from the West Grove began filing in, an electric current of anticipation zinged through me. Time to show Verla and all her snobby high society hangers-on exactly what I was capable of. The game was afoot, and failure was no longer an option. For the first time since this saga had begun, I held the winning hand, and I had every intention of playing it for all it was worth. The gala was in full swing, and by all appearances it was a smashing success. The West Grove staff glided between clusters of Verla's high society friends, deftly keeping champagne flutes topped off and passing trays of delectable hors d'oeuvres. The decorations I'd painstakingly chosen created an elegant yet warm ambiance that seemed to put even the stuffiest of guests at ease. From my vantage point near the entrance, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Score 1 for the underestimated homemaker. "It's going splendidly, isn't it?" Eliza materialized at my side, 2 flutes of bubbly in hand. She passed one to me with a conspiratorial wink. "So far so good," I murmured, accepting the glass, "although the night is still young." Eliza made a derisive sound. "Oh, pish! With how beautifully you've pulled this all together, that sour-faced shrew doesn't stand a chance of raining on your parade." I wasn't quite as confident, but I forced a thin smile nonetheless. "From your lips." No sooner had the words left my mouth than a commotion near the center of the room drew my gaze. There stood Verla, holding court before a cluster of her society matrons, that phony, brittle laugh of hers grating on my ears. "Didn't think the silly girl could pull it off, did you?" Her eyes flicked briefly in my direction, mouth curved in a poisonous smile. I confess, I had my doubts as well, but I suppose even a blind squirrel finds a nut every now and then, yes? A trill of derisive titters followed her jab, and I felt my cheeks flush with humiliated fury. That miserable, spiteful hag, even now, with everything going perfectly, she just couldn't resist taking her petty little swipes. "Stay calm," Eliza murmured in my ear, giving my arm a warning squeeze. I took a deep, steadying breath, reminding myself that letting Verla get a rise out of me now would only give her more ammunition. I was the one holding all the cards tonight. I just had to keep my cool until the perfect moment presented itself. As if on cue, Verla chose that instant to take her performance to the next level. With a loud clearing of her throat, she turned to address the assembled crowd, projecting her reedy voice to carry to every corner of the room. "If I could have everyone's attention, please." She waited for the murmurs to die down before continuing. "First, I'd like to thank you all for coming to support such a worthy cause this evening. As you know, the Dreammakers Foundation does such vital work in ensuring—" I tuned out the rest of her self-aggrandizing preamble, my skin crawling with revulsion. Of course, she would try to make this evening all about her and her beloved pet charity, when the real star of the show was meant to be. Which brings me to expressing my most humble appreciation to our hostess this evening. Verla turned to face me, her smile so sugary sweet it literally made me feel ill. While I admit to some trifling doubts along the way, Lyndon has managed, against all odds, to put together a relatively acceptable little soiree here. Her robust enthusiasm, while occasionally misdirected, is certainly admirable in its own quirky way. I practically sawed my tongue in half with how fiercely I was biting it to keep from firing back a blistering retort. Beside me, Eliza's fingers had gone white from the force of her grip on her champagne flute. "And so, in the interest of promoting a spirit of community and togetherness," Verla went on, wrapping up her backhanded barrage, "I propose we all raise our glasses to our unorthodox host, to Lyndon, as surprising a success as she's managed to be." With a pointed look in my direction, Verla raised her glass, and, like the brainless sycophants they were, her flock of social climbing lemmings followed suit, echoing the mocking toast, "To Lyndon." My face had gone utterly rigid, a muscle twitching spastically in my jaw as I struggled not to completely combust on the spot. Stupid, naive me, part of me had actually begun to hope that maybe, just maybe, Verla might finally give me a modicum of respect after I'd pulled off this spectacular evening. But no, of course she couldn't. That was simply too much to ask of her withered, rancid soul. I should have known she'd find some way to twist the knife, to keep me firmly in my place as the bumbling little housewife tagging along in her formidable wake. Well, screw that. And screw her, too. I drained my champagne glass in one fiery swallow, then looked past the frozen smile plastered across Verla's smug face, past the stranglehold of her cult of soulless, identity-free drones, to the one person in the crowd whose opinion truly mattered. Beckett's eyes met mine, and the unmistakable pity I saw reflected there was like a dousing of ice water to my burning rage. In that instant, a wild, desperate notion took hold, one that terrified me nearly as much as it exhilarated me. Verla wanted a war? She was about to get one, then. May the pettiest woman win. Lifting my chin, I plastered on my most brilliant, disarming smile and strode out into the center of the room. Game on, you hateful old buzzard. I'll admit, part of me still harbored a tiny flicker of hope that Verla might back down once she saw me approaching. Maybe, just maybe, a shred of decency might kick in, and she'd recognize how far she'd gone over the line this time. Yeah, right, who was I kidding? The instant that brittle, self-satisfied smile stretched across her face, I knew there would be no turning back. With a saccharine trill of laughter, she spread her arms in a mocking semblance of welcome. Why, Lyndon? To what do we owe this unscripted bout of spontaneity? Taking a deep, steadying breath, I pasted on my most winning smile. Two could play at her vicious little game. Verla, I'm so pleased you've been enjoying yourself this evening. Though I must disagree with your assessment of me as a... What was it? An unorthodox success? The slight narrowing of her eyes was the only hint of her growing discomfort, but I pressed on, raising my voice to ensure the crowd around us could hear every word. If tonight has been a success, and from where I'm standing, it certainly seems to have been, then I believe the credit belongs solely to me and my efforts, don't you agree? I let my gaze sweep across the rapt semicircle of spectators, taking in their rapt expressions. My voice remained light and conversational, but with an unmistakable edge of steel. After all, I was the one who coordinated every last detail, from the catering to the decor to the guest list itself. I was the one who invested weeks of my time, not to mention my own money, into ensuring this evening went off without a single hiccup. While others may have dabbled in attempts to undermine or micromanage certain elements, I'd say you'll all agree those efforts failed quite spectacularly. Verla's face had gone an unflattering shade of mottled crimson, but she seemed to have temporarily lost the ability to formulate a response. I could practically see the wheels spinning furiously in her mind as she tried to regain control of the narrative. That's preposterous. I'll have you know, I was absolutely instrumental. But her words were drowned out by another voice cutting cleanly across the marble foyer, one that brooked no argument. Is that so, Verla? Margaret strode into view, perfectly coiffed head held high. For such a tiny, impeccably dressed woman, she certainly commanded an unmistakable presence. Verla's jaw clicked shut, her eyes darting back and forth in bewilderment as a small cluster of grim-faced socialites fanned out behind Margaret, forming a formidable vanguard. Because that's not quite how I remember things transpiring, Margaret continued, her tone carrying a lethal sort of pleasantness. In fact, from where I was standing, you were the one who seemed determined to sabotage this whole affair at every possible turn through a never-ending series of lies, manipulations, and petty acts of treachery. Does that sound more accurate? A tense silence hung over the crowd as the words sank in. I could see the speculative, scandalized expressions on the spectators' faces as they began taking in the new configuration of forces at play here. Verla, who had been standing at the smug apex of her perceived domain just moments earlier, now found herself unnervingly isolated, flanked by a seemingly random assortment of well-connected society doyens wearing equally thunderous expressions. Margaret pressed her advantage, sensibly clad shoulders squaring as she moved to stand at my side. Or perhaps Eliza here would like to weigh in. As if on cue, Eliza stepped into view, mouth set in a thin, humorless line. Gladly. I think it's high time we all had a reckoning about Verla's true colors and the vicious, conniving behavior she's been lording over all of us hapless peons for far too long. My heart was thundering in my chest now, an almost giddy feeling of vindication starting to set in as I watched these respected pillars of the community systematically close ranks against Verla. She was well and truly outnumbered, and she knew it. Frantically, her eyes darted around the room, trying in vain to latch on to any hint of sympathetic support. But everywhere she looked, she saw only scrutiny, judgment, betrayal. This is outrageous, she sputtered, spinning back to face me with raw desperation crackling in her gaze. Those horrible women, they're lying. Lyndon, you can't possibly believe these ridiculous accusations. For one brief, insane heartbeat, I felt a pang of pity for her. Underneath all that bluster and bile, she was still someone's wife, someone's mother. Then I saw it. That same sneering derision slithering its way across her features as her fragile grasp on composure slipped away. The loathing in her eyes as she glowered at me, like I was something revolting she'd found stuck to the bottom of her shoe. That was all it took to banish any shred of guilt or mercy from my heart. Drawing myself up to my full height, I held Verla's gaze with every ounce of white-hot fury that had been smoldering inside me for years now. The words that finally came were calm, implacable, utterly devoid of emotion. You've spent far too long belittling me, Verla, making me feel small, insignificant, like some sort of worthless little housewife beneath your notice. But I'm finally seeing you for what you really are. A twisted, mutated shell of a human being, driven solely by self-interest and greed. Someone so hollowed out by their own pettiness and delusions that they've willingly turned into a monster. A creature who lashes out and tries to destroy anyone who dares outshine them or show them up in even the slightest way. I leveled an accusatory finger straight at her chest, voice rising to drown out her incoherent sputtering. Well, not anymore, Verla. Not here. Not tonight. My smile was as dazzling as it was icy, throwing her own words back in her face. This is my moment, and it's time for you to know your place. The aftermath of Verla's very public unraveling was, well, honestly, it was pretty glorious. As the last few gawking stragglers filed out in the wee hours of the morning, I couldn't help but savor the almost palpable buzz of scandalized gossip that hung in the air. By the time the dust settled, there wouldn't be a member of the local beau monde who didn't know exactly what sort of treacherous, narcissistic snake Verla truly was. Good. Let them whisper and cluck their judgmental tongues. Her reign of toxic superiority was officially over. Well, that was certainly dramatic. Beckett appeared at my side, surveying the disheveled remnants of the gala with a bemused expression. I shot him a sidelong glance, one eyebrow arched. You're telling me, although I have to admit, seeing that miserable harpy finally get her comeuppance, utterly priceless. A flicker of some unidentifiable emotion passed over his face, there and gone again before I could parse it. I had no idea you and the others had cooked up such an elaborate scheme. You certainly gave Mother a taste of her own medicine. There was an undercurrent to his words that instantly put me on the defensive. What's that supposed to mean? Beckett shook his head, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. Nothing. I'm just surprised, I guess. This whole cloak and dagger act isn't exactly your typical M.O., is all. My jaw clenched as a hot flare of resentment licked through me. Of course he would minimize what I'd done, what I'd endured for months at his wretched mother's hands. Just like always, staying neatly balanced on that fence, afraid to take a side. Well, maybe that's the problem, I bit out, making no effort to disguise my sarcasm. Maybe I've spent too long trying to be the picture-perfect, conflict-avoidant little wifey, while your monstrous mother has been treating me like a repulsive insect she can't wait to crush under her heel. Beckett actually took a step back, looking stricken. Lyndon, I didn't mean... No, let me finish. I jabbed him in the chest with one finger, years of pent-up anger and resentment finally boiling over. Ever since we got married, it's been the same old song and dance with Verla. The digs, the manipulations, the outright cruelty, all because I'm not a glamorous socialite like she wants for her precious son. His mouth worked soundlessly, gaze darting away guiltily. But I was on a roll now, unable to stop the torrent of rage even if I'd wanted to. Well, you know what, Beckett? I'm done with her mind games. I'm done with her narcissistic need to control every damn aspect of our lives. And most of all... I stepped in close, holding his wary stare with an intensity that made his Adam's apple bob nervously. I'm done being the nice doormat wife who just smiles and takes her abuse because that's what's expected of me. The words hung between us, harsh and uncompromising. A muscle ticked spasmodically in Beckett's jaw as he processed my tirade, expression unrateable. Just when I was sure I'd pushed him too far, he surprised me by letting out a soft, rueful chuckle. Can't say I disagree with you there, babe. His gaze softened, the briefest ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. You were incredible tonight. I meant what I said, the way you orchestrated that whole, whatever it was. I've never seen you so fired up, so fearless. I blinked, the wind abruptly knocked out of my sails by his unexpected bout of understanding. It was pretty badass, wasn't it? I couldn't help but agree with a self-satisfied smirk. He laughed outright at that. The most badass. Looping an arm around my waist, he tugged me close and planted a lingering kiss on my forehead. I love you, you know that? Even when you're being a total hellraiser. I snuggled into his embrace, feeling a bone-deep sense of contentment settle over me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, everything seemed okay. More than okay, it felt downright exhilarating, like a crushing weight had been lifted from my shoulders. So what do we do now? I murmured against the soft cotton of his shirt. How do we make sure your mother sticks to her promise of leaving us alone for good? Beckett drew back slightly, cupping my face in his hands as he met my gaze with unmistakable tenderness. We could always look into hiring a full-time security detail, he deadpanned. Although personally, I have a feeling one focused, ass-kicking wife will be more than enough to keep the old battle axe in line from here on out. My laughter rang out through the empty foyer, bright and unrestrained. For once, there was no need to look over my shoulder for Verla's disapproving scowl, no reason to brace for her next round of snide belittlements. It was just Beckett and me, stepping out from behind the suffocating shadow she'd been casting over our lives for far too long. And you know what? That sensation of freedom, of breaking out from beneath her toxic influence once and for all, it felt pretty damn amazing.